Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for what I think is going to be a very interesting and lively discussion about energy opportunities in Brazil. My name is Arthur Deakin, and I co-lead the energy practice here at AMI. So in terms of what to expect, I will start with a brief 10-minute presentation on what we think are the most exciting topics in the Brazilian energy market, followed by a 45 to 50-minute panel discussion with five experts. Some quick housekeeping items before we get started. The presentation will be recorded and it will be shared after the fact. So if you have to leave at any point in time, you'll be sure to get the presentation after we're done. If you want to ask questions, please use the chat box on the right side of your screen. We'll try to answer all your questions within the next hour. And if we don't get to it, we'll make sure to send you an email after the event. For those of you that don't know much about AMI, let me just briefly tell you what we do. So if you move forward to the next couple of slides, Bill. So we're a leading market research firm focused on several different sectors, specifically in Latin America, in the region. The sectors, which include energy, is the one I lead with some of my colleagues here at the firm. Since the early 90s, we've completed more than 3,000 projects and assignments in the region. And I think the best way to visualize what we do is by giving an example. So let's say you're a Canadian or an American investor, and you're looking to expand your Brazilian renewables portfolio, but you're not really sure where and how to invest your money. So what we do is conduct interviews with primary sources in Brazil and do our own analysis and due diligence to provide recommendations backed by data that advise things such as which projects to focus on, who to partner with, the regulations you have to follow, and some of the main risks that you have to mitigate. So if we move forward to the next slide, you'll see just some of the clients we've worked with in the past. And okay, moving forward with that covered, let's move on with the presentation. So in this chart, you'll see in the next slide, through an analysis done by AMI, we see that both Chile and Peru, which are large importers of fossil fuels, will be naturally hurt the most by high energy prices. This is because of the inflationary impact on their currencies and the increased cost of energy imports. Brazil and Guyana, on the other hand, who have high quality and relatively cheap hydrocarbons, will increase production and will benefit the most as global demand increases. Those two countries, however, will need to tame inflation, which we're seeing at record levels, and also avoid increasing subsidies to try and maintain fuel prices at a reasonable rate. If we look towards the bottom of the chart, some of you may be surprised at the fact that Argentina, which is a large energy producer, is going to be impacted negatively. But the reason is that they're not energy self-sufficient, and they need to import an abundance of US liquid natural gas, LNG, especially during winter months. So with that challenge, they'll be forced to depend heavily on imports, and they can't continue to subsidize their energy price because they recently struck a deal with the IMF. So this is just important to keep in mind as we move forward to the next slide. The higher energy prices will have many Latin American countries eager to pump out more oil, including Brazil, of course. Brazil and its energy ministry has estimated that it will increase oil production by roughly 300,000 barrels per day, which reflects around 10% of its current production. And estimates from the Brazilian Research Agency project that by 2031, so within the next 9 years, Brazil will increase its oil production by 66%. So from 3.2 million barrels per day to 5.2 million barrels per day. Gas production is actually going to increase by more than double, so 2x. Most of that's going to come from the pre-salt reserves, which I'm sure many of you are familiar about. But around 10 to 15% will also come from undiscovered resources. So Energy companies are paying close attention to this. We saw in a recent open acreage tender that Ecopetrol, the Colombian state-owned oil company, and Shell signed a couple offshore blocks that have interesting gas potential. So they're looking at exploring these undiscovered resources in the pre-salt fields. If we move on to the next slide, we see that Brazil is going to add more installed distributed generation capacity this year than in the past decade combined. We see in the chart that in this year alone, they're expected to add an impressive 17.1 gigawatts. So this is because of a variety of recent factors, which we outline here on the right-hand side. But the biggest reason is a recently approved law, law number 14-3000, that eliminates a majority of subsidies that are provided for distributed generation projects that are approved after 2022. So many developers are rushing to get this approval before the year ends, and that's leading to a spike in demand. Markets in the region that have similar distributed generation maturity, like Chile, are also phasing out some of these subsidies. So it'll be interesting to see which markets, perhaps some of the smaller, medium-sized markets, actually provide subsidies and incentives for distributed generation that are being phased out in some of these more mature and larger markets like Brazil and Chile. Some larger investors are also expecting to see some greater returns in utility scale solar and wind plants. So that's something to consider if you're interested in diving in the distributed generation sector. As we move forward to the next slide, here are just some of the new deals that have resulted from the opening of Brazil's energy market, which has been caused by the liberalization of the gas sector to smaller regulatory changes like the approval of cost efficiency mechanisms for hybrid power plants. I won't really go into the details of each of these deals because it'll take too long, and we'll discuss them more in the panel. But we can't really move on without first mentioning the potential privatization of Eletrobras. It's been quite a roller coaster. So for those of you that don't know what's happening, the privatization bill for the largest utility in the region was approved last June by Congress, so almost a year ago, and it's now being reviewed by the country's watchdog, which is the TCU, it's a Federal Court of Accounts. The Minister of Energy has recently said that the privatization will happen by July of this year, but with presidential elections coming up this October, I personally don't really see it happening. Brazil has a lot of horse trading politics. There's a lot of vested interest. It really is going to be complicated to get this privatization through before the end of the year. We saw this just this week. The judge in charge of the privatization hearing had to be convinced at the last second not to introduce what they call a poison pill into the legislation, which would allow a potential Lula administration to reverse the privatization, to reverse the deal. It didn't happen, but the fact that it's even being considered shows that there's a lot of politics involved in this process. We'll see what happens, but it's not looking great for Eletrobras's prospects. As we move on to the next slide, we'll take a look at where the capital is expected to go within the next decade. So $500 billion in investments is expected for the energy matrix through 2031. That's $500 billion US dollars, it's a big amount. Surprisingly, as we see here to the chart to the left, 82% of that is going to oil and gas, most of which includes exploration and production. So it's pretty clear that oil and gas will still be a major play in the country, at least through the next decade. As I mentioned, they have high quality crude, high levels of gas in the pre-salt fields. So that demand is going to keep going up as the world tries to move away from Russian dependency and looking at other sources of supply. We also expect many private and public mergers to happen, including divestments. We recently even saw this with the Nell's potential sale of its Goiás distribution company just this week. And I think it's important to point out that despite the surge in investments, local companies still struggle to get the necessary funding for their energy developments for a variety of reasons. There's political instability, high interest rates, tightening of the public purse, local currency risk. So this gap is going to be mostly filled by private capital. We estimate around 60 to 70%, as well as some debt financing and public equity, which is where companies such as the Toronto Stock Exchange, which is part of this panel and has done a great job raising billions of dollars for local companies in the region, will come to play. But we'll touch more upon these issues in our panel, which is coming up next. So we move on. Before we get started, here are just some of the questions that still remain for energy companies and investors. We won't be able to answer all these questions within the webinar because they're longer term strategic questions that require deep research with on-the-ground interviews and analysis. This is something that we could answer with specific studies in the AMI energy practice. So it includes, what are the major risks and challenges faced by foreign investors operating in Brazil? What are the expected outcomes for the presidential elections and the impact in the energy sector? Those are just some of the questions that we can answer through our research. So keeping those in mind, we just wanted to move to a quick 30-second poll question to our audience members. So please just take your time to answer that, and we'll move on with the panel discussion right after. Great, we'll give you 10 more seconds and then we'll move on. Okay, great. Thank you very much for answering that. Let's move on to our panel discussion. So today we're joined by 5 esteemed experts, 16 panelists, starting with Ricardo from the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board. He's a managing director there. David Chelich from TMX, Toronto Stock Exchange, where he's the head of business development for global energy and diversified industries. Corey Rutten from Avo Petro, president and CEO. Guilherme, who's an intelligence manager of the power sector from the Brazilian Development Bank. And last but not least, Rupert from National Bank Financial, where he's a managing director of infrastructure and Cleantech. Thank you all very much for joining me. So to get started, I wanted to pose this question to Corey, and then TMX and anyone else that wants to jump in. At this point in time, Ukraine war is headline news across the world. We saw just yesterday Russia cutting off or threatening to cut off gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria. My question is, how will this war and higher oil prices impact Brazil and the wider region as a whole? And with that in mind, are the pre-salt reserves still an attractive opportunity for foreign investors?
Yeah, no, thank you, Arthur. So, first of all, I think the higher oil price dynamic started much before the crisis, and I think it was partly as a result of normalizing demand as COVID restrictions came off, but probably more importantly, as a result of chronic underinvestment in the energy sector, and then that whole situation was exacerbated by the situation in Ukraine. And I think it's not only impacting oil prices, it's also impacting natural gas prices. And I think, the reality is of this oil price cycle, the supply side response is much slower than what we've seen historically. And that's partly because of reduced access to capital. It's partly due to much higher debt levels entering this cycle and more capital discipline as a result. That ends up translating into higher volatility, which is very difficult for the market. I think at the end of the day, it's an example, the world's requiring more energy, not less. And I think the situation today really highlights the necessity of continued responsible investment in the oil and gas sector, along with investments in the energy transition and new technologies. I think you touched on it pretty well for Brazil. Obviously, the higher oil prices actually has a net benefit. Being an exporter obviously has an impact on inflation. On the contrary, Brazil surprisingly actually imports, up to 50% of its natural gas at times, which is impacted by global LNG prices. And the majority of natural gas contracts locally in Brazil do have a link to Brent oil prices as well. So it again translates into higher local energy prices. One of the big things that's been happening is Petrobras has sold a bunch of almost all their onshore upstream inventory of production and reserves, at what looked like pretty expensive metrics. And I think one of the things the oil price increase has done is it's helped make those acquisition metrics look much more attractive. And overall, you're going to see a huge increase in activity, particularly on those clusters where they've recently changed to new owners and now have the benefit of these higher commodity prices. And for Alvopetro, we're certainly making a big investment in 2022 in expanding our onshore natural gas business.
Great, thank you for that. David or anyone else want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I'll just echo what Corey had said. So, how's the Ukraine war and higher oil prices going to impact Brazil? Well, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the International Energy Agency, they were predicting that global demand would rise by about 3.5 million barrels per day in 2022 and reach close to 100 million barrels per day. And so that level would basically match the previous demand record in 2019, which was just prior to the COVID pandemic. So from a supply perspective, OPEC possesses, approximately what I read, from research analysts, approximately 4 to 4.5 million barrels per day of effective spare capacity, and it's basically set to exhaust that surplus within the next 12 to 18 months. So even prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the world was facing a very tight supply-demand fundamentals for oil. And now, if you take into consideration Russia, which is the world's second top producer of crude oil after Saudi Arabia, and they produce approximately 10 million barrels per day of oil and liquids, and they're now facing global sanctions to its oil exports from countries that are opposed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As Corey mentioned, these sanctions are only going to exacerbate an already tight global supply issue for oil. And this was evidenced when crude oil prices spiked to a 14-year high of $140 a barrel in early March. So what does this really mean for Brazil? So, Brazil is not only the largest energy consumer in South America, it's also the largest and probably the most important oil producer in the region. Brazil's current output of around 3 million barrels per day. And to your comment, it's aiming for a 10% increase this year to about 3.3 million barrels per day in 2022. And Brazil currently exports about a third of its oil production to other nations. So the oil and gas market is extremely important to Brazil. It's important to the Brazilian economy, represents about 10% of the country's GDP. So I think the rise in oil prices right now, short term, is definitely a net benefit for Brazil. But here's the caveat. Having said that, these high costs of energy, it's lowering consumers and industry's capacity to handle cost pressures. And higher oil prices are inflationary for consumers at the gas pump and for those industrial companies that use oil as an input for manufacturing in their goods. So higher oil costs, they get passed along to the consumer. And that's not exactly what you want to hear when the world is currently facing substantial inflationary pressures. So demand destruction and downward pressure on the price of crude is a distinct possibility. So from my perspective, right now, short term, positive net benefit to Brazil, but it's going to be difficult to predict which way the situation in the markets are going to go. But it does seem like that we're poised for a period of higher energy prices that are driven by war and combined with tight market fundamentals.
Great, thank you for setting the stage on that. Ricardo, I wanted to point the question to you. How will Brazil be impacted by the clean energy transition, and what opportunities and risks will stand out for investors and energy companies?
Hi, Arthur, and thanks for the opportunity. of speaking to you all here. We at CPPIB are very excited about the actual and potential investment opportunities which the energy transition will bring to Brazil. As many of you know, Brazil has many issues, but it also has some comparative advantages, and one of them is the fact that it has a very clean energy matrix. So more than 50% of the energy matrix of Brazil overall is clean, and more than 85% of the electricity generated in Brazil comes from clean sources. So we expect that in general to position Brazil and specifically investment opportunities related to the energy transition well. And in that sense, we made the decision to invest in the power generation, in the renewable energy generation segment in the country a few years ago, by being one of the co-controlling shareholders of Auren, which is one of the largest power generation platforms in the country. Where we see the main opportunities, I would say we're excited about the deployment of renewables, wind and solar in the country. And we're also very positive about distributed generation. Obviously, you mentioned on your presentation, there's a bit of a short-term pickup because of the changes in the regulation. But we think that the trend of what we call retail customers, or small to mid-sized customers joining the free market in the coming years, decentralizing and becoming less reliant on the distribution companies and acquiring electricity from a combination of wind, solar, batteries, and some self-generation will provide a very powerful opportunity for investors like us. In terms of the risks, I would highlight two. One of them is resource risk. Obviously, as the matrix becomes even more dependent on renewables, there's more unpredictability, as we have been seeing with poor hydrology in the last 10 years or so in Brazil, with a very persistent GSF. And I think the second risk is mainly political. I think to David's point, high energy prices and high inflation, and coupled with large investments required for the energy transition, end up increasing tariffs for end customers, and that can actually provide an incentive to some politicians to start putting pressure on price caps and on changes in the regulation. We don't see that discussion happening in Brazil, but this is something which we need to monitor closely.
Yeah, that's a great point. We saw the replacement of the Petrobras CEO after pressure from Bolsonaro regarding higher oil prices, and it's definitely going to be a very contentious topic leading up to the elections. But we also agree that we don't see any changes in pricing policies for Petrobras. Rupert, I wanted to direct the same question to you. Canada is definitely more advanced when it comes to energy transition investments, especially when related to hydrogen, EVs, etc. What kind of opportunities do you see in Brazil that may reflect what's happening in the Canadian market?
Yeah, thank you, Arthur. Thanks for having me here today. I'll add a little to what Ricardo has said on opportunity. I'd say the energy transition is a great opportunity for investment in Brazil. As Ricardo said, the energy is already quite clean in Brazil, But of course, there's a huge resource potential and potential for big demand growth in the future. Where to invest? I'd say the one energy solution that looks most attractive to me for Brazil in the long run would be solar. However, that said, my favorite saying for the energy transition is there is no silver bullet for the energy transition, only silver buckshot. You basically have to use the best resource that you have available to you, and that's different everywhere you go in the world. But looking at Brazil with its big hydro base and great solar radiation, we know solar can be cheap. In fact, in the right places in the world, solar can be the cheapest form of energy, cheaper than anything. We've seen long-term contracts signed for less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour, and I think Brazil is in a position to see that kind of cost. But also,
Great.
with the hydro storage capacity that you have in Brazil, operating at a less than 60% capacity factor on nameplate on average, the hydro reservoirs in Brazil mostly want to store water and can firm up the intermittent supply from solar. So I think that looks like a good opportunity, and we're seeing Canadian companies like Brookfield investing in solar in Brazil. What stands out for risk? Maybe we'll come back to some of the risks with future questions, but foreign investors are typically worried about FX risk. To get around that, hedging is tricky with the real, often for Canadian, North American investors and European investors. We have seen some contracts on renewables signed in US dollars in Latin America. That can reduce the risk. But inflation protection on contracts typically goes a long way to hedging inflation risk as well. Counterparty risk is another risk the investors typically worry about. But we have seen in Brazil a good liquid market for credit-worthy off-takers. So that hasn't tended to be a problem either. A final one I'll touch on is inflation. And inflation, of course, can raise the cost of building projects, but we are seeing power prices rise in response. But in the short run, investors in this space that tend to be yield investors are looking at alternative investment opportunities today on bonds, for example, and that is making the equity potentially a little more expensive.
Yeah, that's very good points, and I think really sets the stage in terms of what investors are looking at in terms of yields and different alternative investments. Thank you, Rupert. So moving forward, I wanted to go back to Ricardo. How are companies and investors capitalizing on the liberalization of the gas market? We've seen a lot of joint ventures among private players. Do you see that continuing? What are your views on the gas market?
Yeah, so it has been an interesting market, although the pace of change has definitely frustrated a lot of people for a number of reasons. So from the initial ambition of having a very dynamic market in Brazil with a lot of abundant and cheap gas, which would really foster industrial activities with a lot of new industries wanting to either convert to gas or install new plants in Brazil. That has definitely fallen short of that. But still, in a world of intermittent renewable resources, natural gas as an anchor for power generation will be playing an increasingly important role in Brazil. So we as CPPIB looked at a few investment opportunities in the sector. Unfortunately, we have not been able to win any of these. These were mostly competitive processes of asset sales by Petrobras. But this continues to be an interesting sector. So some of our peers like Brookfield, GIC, CDPQ have been investing in gas midstream, EIG also on TBG, and we, this is a space in which probably the presence of Petrobras has reduced substantially. So as a result of that, we may see some M&A activity related to some of the private players willing to sell part of their stakes in the coming years, and that could be something interesting for us. Other things in midstream infrastructure like storage or a significant expansion in the pipeline network in Brazil, I'm personally more skeptical. I don't think we'll have a lot of transformational new investments in midstream and downstream.
Great, good points. Yeah, I think sometimes just the will and the desire to win the investment is not enough. There's a lot of different factors that come into play. And Corey, as a player in the oil and gas sector in Brazil, what do you see in this opening of the gas market? Are you seeing any specific opportunities? What challenges are you facing?
Yeah, so maybe just a little bit of background for those that don't know. Alvopetro, we're a Toronto Stock Exchange listed company, and we were actually pioneering the onshore natural gas business from an independent basis, before the market really opened up. So on July 5th of 2020, a little over, I think, 21 months ago, Alvopetro became the first independent company, so other than Petrobras, to deliver sales specified natural gas into the local distribution network in Brazil. And that was before the new gas regulations were finalized and enacted. So I think our experience is a really good example of what can be achieved, probably even more so now that the regulations have been formalized. Our project, just speaking of partnerships, the upstream part of our business, our core project is a joint venture with our unit partner. We're roughly 50-50 in that. And then our share of our natural gas production gets commercialized through a 100% Alvopetro controlled midstream and gas sales solution. We signed a long-term gas sales agreement with the local state distribution company. We built an 11-kilometer pipeline and the first non-Petrobras owned gas processing facility in Brazil. We did the final part there with the help of Enerflex, which is another Canadian listed public company headquartered in Calgary under a build, own, operate, maintain model. So it's like a capital lease and an operating lease. It's a really important partnership for us. It was in effect a critical financing for us at the time, and it significantly de-risked the project from both an execution and an operating perspective, having a world-class partner like Enerflex involved. We also had a debt capital provider partnership with another Canadian outfit out of Montreal called Cordiant Capital. And obviously Brazil needs more natural gas, and I think there's lots of room for more partnerships like this. And I think one of the biggest impediments for new natural gas supply is for companies investing in the space, the lead times associated with converting technical successes into production and cash flow are very difficult, especially in a world where access to capital is difficult. So if you can shorten that time frame, I think that will be an important part of the ongoing success of the sector.
Thank you very much. I think that we can move on to the financing of the energy sector and what kinds of opportunities that investors are looking at. I wanted to assign this question to Guilherme. You work in the Development Bank of Brazil. Who is financing the energy sector in Brazil, and what kinds of different mechanisms are they using? Can you just give your perspective on that?
Sure, Arthur. Thank you for the invitation. Glad to be here. I would start saying that BNDES has always been supporting the energy sector in Brazil and had a major role, especially in the power sector. We have financed in the last 20 years about 60 to 70% of the added capacity of the power mix, and always with a strong focus on renewables. So today our strategy is to explicitly to induce, bring the market together and help develop the capital markets in Brazil, because the gap of investments that will be needed will need much more than BNDES alone to finance. And so our goals are explicitly to share risks and promote new kinds of financing, more bonds and instruments that are more suitable to sharing risks with market and helping developing the capital markets in Brazil. So I would say that investors can also count on BNDES to be as a security of supply for fundings in these projects, but we want to develop the capital market and bring the market together to a more mature level to keep financing the sector. In terms of kinds of opportunities, I would go one step back on the question about energy transition. So to say that Brazil is very well positioned on energy transition, and not only in renewables in terms of potential of renewables and competitiveness of renewables, but also on regarding our oil and gas sector, that Brazil is still is competitive and has a low emitter oil and gas sector. So and a large capacity of offsetting the emissions that they still will be emitting. So having said that, going back to the power sector, the recent development of the free markets, because power markets in Brazil we have a regulated market that has also been the largest share of trading energy, but in the last years we saw a high increase on the share of the free market, the unregulated market, that today only large consumers can be in that environment and trade energy and buy directly from the generators. But what we see is a great opportunity and a virtuous cycle for since we have very competitive renewable sources as solar and especially wind, we see consumers that are increasingly increasing their commitment with ESG agenda and sustainability, and they see in this free market opportunity to match their interests with these very competitive projects, renewable projects, and that's a very important opportunity for finance, for investors who want to also invest in these sustainable assets. So that's a great opportunity in Brazil, the increase of free market, and BNDES has been very aware of that and tried to develop ways to solve the bankability issues of this free market, since we don't see these corporate PPAs in so longer terms as we used to see on the regulated market, when we saw 20 to 25 year PPAs. Free market, we see much lower terms, and that's a problem for financing, because financing terms are the 20 years, and if we don't have contracts with the same term, we had to develop new innovative ways to approach and provide tools for our evaluations to our financial models to keep financing this. And that the model that we developed, we hope that, and we also are already seeing that the market is that we took the first step, but the market is going after us and seeing that this is a risk that can be taken.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's the free market probably 25% or so right now, but there's estimates that it could make up to 50% of the total market if certain legislation is passed. I wanted to just remind the audience that they can ask questions in the chat bar to the right. We'll get to them within the next with the remaining 20 minutes or so. Staying on this topic of financing, I wanted to point this towards Rupert and David, perhaps starting with Rupert. So what's the Canadian and global perspective on investing in renewable energy? Can you guys comment on that?
Yeah, thank you, Arthur. I'd say for investors in renewable energy in Canada, there's a healthy universe of investment opportunities on public markets with access to debt and equity capital, but really from global investors. I think this really is a global market. That would be my key takeaway. But how did Canada get here? Like Brazil, it's a large country with large infrastructure projects, large hydro plants. So we have a strong talent pool in power markets. We also have a strong resource industry, so a number of entrepreneurs with good resource development expertise that translates well into renewables. So using that skill set, we saw about 30 years ago, the independent power market start to gain momentum, and that accelerated in the last 15, 20 years ago with government contracts initially. And those contracts allowed these companies to initially attract the equity and debt capital they needed to help them grow quickly, but then to take that scale and to start looking globally. Now today, I'd say my focus is mostly on public capital markets. These stocks in this sector are popular investments with ESG-focused investors, growth investors, yield investors. But again, the key takeaway here is that there really are no limitations from borders for investment in this sector. Increasingly, I'd say the Canadian investment perspective is really global. You look at two things. First of all, the Canadian companies in this sector, like Brookfield, they're investing globally. They're in the US, Europe, Asia, Latin America. Canada's a pretty small part of the portfolios of these companies today. We are seeing a little bit of resurgence of growth in Canada, but Canada's a pretty small country. But secondly, and more importantly, I'd say the investors in these companies are global. You know, renewable energy stocks are attracting attention from impact investors, and they don't have too many pure play investment opportunities globally. So if you can find a sector with scale like they have in Canada, those stocks are attracting attention from global investors in Europe, the US, Asia, Australia. So, bottom line, I think this is very much a global market, and you can look to global capital markets for financing.
Thank you, Rupert. David, do you want to add anything to that?
So what we're seeing specifically in Canada and also the Toronto Stock Exchange. So from a renewable energy and clean energy perspective, we're starting to see more startups in the pure renewable energy space. So wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, carbon capture, storage, and sequestration space. And we're also seeing cleaner fuel manufacturers such as biofuels and synthetic fuels. And also existing utility companies and independent power production companies are also transitioning to lower GHG and CO2 business models in order to attract capital under this growing global ESG investment initiative. And this transition to cleaner forms of energy is well underway and gaining momentum, as Rupert mentioned. With respect to the pure play renewable energy sector, i.e. wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, we see the continuation of a strong industry fundamentals driving global growth and continued investor demand as the world transitions to cleaner and greener forms of energy. And just some of the larger macros that are pushing this demand forward. We're seeing reports that global energy demand is forecast to grow by, say, 20%, 25% by the year 2040. Approximately $25 trillion of cumulative investment is going to be required in new energy supply to meet this demand by 2040. And 2/3 of that is actually going to be earmarked for the power sector. So solar, wind, and biofuels are going to play a larger role in this global electricity production. And investor demand for pure play renewable energy continues to be strong, and capital is being directed to these companies for a number of reasons, but primarily it's the global decarbonization, which is providing organic growth and acquisition opportunities. We're seeing installation and operational costs are competitive with traditional electricity generating methods. We're seeing long-term contracts with creditworthy off-takers, providing more certainty to investors around revenue and free cash flow, and that helps reduce some of the financial risk. We're seeing these companies, they're paying dividends, or dividend-paying companies, which is attractive to income-oriented investors. And as Rupert mentioned, there's this institutional investors that need to fulfill their ESG mandates and directives. So strong industry fundamentals and investor demand are evidenced by the fact that our S&P TSX Renewable Energy and Clean Energy Technology Index was up over 50% since January of 2019. So this just bodes well for TSX listed pure play renewable energy companies and IPPs and utility companies that are transitioning to a lower CO2 business model.
Yeah, good points. Thank you, David. I wanted to move on to a question from the audience. Thank you, Roy, for your question. So he said that Brazil has excellent offshore renewable resources such as good wind, constant waves, and ocean thermal energy conversion. How do the panelists see this market developing? Maybe Corey can touch upon this, or anyone else that feels comfortable in answering this question. So prospects of offshore renewable resources in Brazil.
Yeah, I think that's probably better addressed by another person on the panel that's kind of outside of our area of influence.
Absolutely. If anyone else want to comment on that?
I'll take a stab at it. I'm not overly familiar with the resources in Brazil, but tracking the growth in renewable energy globally, offshore wind is now becoming very cost competitive. We are seeing a number of RFPs in Europe where the winners and the ultimate builders of these assets are doing it reliant only on corporate contracts or on the spot market. So it clearly has matured to the point now where it is going to become an important energy source. It helps to diversify energy supply, typically easier to permit with less pushback from local concerns. So I think that if Brazil was to come up with an attractive RFP scheme, I think you'd see global investors that would be attracted to the market. Investors like Brookfield that just this morning announced that it would be participating in RFPs in Europe with partners. And of course, they're already active in Brazil and keen to diversify their Brazilian supply. I mean, we should ask them if they'd be interested, but I suspect you'll see global interest.
Yeah, Guilherme, I'll let you touch upon this. Yeah, we see, Colombia developing an offshore wind map, several different countries looking at it, and I think Brazil is probably the one with the best resources for offshore wind. Guilherme, what's your take on that?
Thank you, Arthur. We saw recently a new regulation on the use of the areas of the sea areas for offshore activities, for offshore wind. I think there are a lot of interested. There are a lot of developers quite advanced on projects, offshore wind projects. I think that since market the additions of the power mix are mostly driven by competitiveness, as I said, so competitive onshore wind and solar. I don't see in the very short term these projects going online, the offshore wind, but definitely it's a huge potential. We already have about 80 gigawatts of projects asking for licenses to be deployed, but I think that oil and gas has a lot of synergy here in Brazil with offshore wind. They definitely will help develop this industry because of our expertise on offshore oil production. So it's also an opportunity regarding energy transition to develop a new source of energy. and help decrease the carbon footprint of oil and gas industry in Brazil. So I don't see in the this year or next year investments going online, but definitely in the midterm until the end of the decade, we'll see offshore wind projects start being deployed in Brazil.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's more of a midterm prospect, such as similar to green hydrogen. We see, oil and gas companies developing these projects across the world, like Shell. They already have the offshore expertise and the resources, so it makes sense to have these synergies. Just before we move on to Alexandra's question, I wanted to touch upon green hydrogen, which is, of course, a very hot topic around the world. What is the prospect for green hydrogen in Brazil, and how does it compare to Chile, who we've seen be the pioneer of these projects in the region? Guilherme or anyone else that wants to comment on this?
I can comment. I'm also not an expert, but we are investors not only in Brazil but also in other parts of Latin America, including Chile, and we are really impressed by the recent green agenda in the country and the positive outlook for green hydrogen projects and initiatives in the country. And most of that is driven by a very competitive renewable generation, especially solar in the north of the country. We don't see any reason why Brazil cannot be as competitive as Chile on green hydrogen. There's, as we have been mentioning here, abundance of solar and wind resources, availability of land, a very sizable, a very relevant manufacturing sector, which can provide an anchor, which can be an anchor, and without having to rely only or mostly on exports of green hydrogen. We have the ports for export, and Guilherme would probably know better, but there are projects going on in the northeast of Brazil, in the state of Ceará, in the port of Pecém. So I do see Brazil becoming a green hydrogen hub in the medium to long term. Now, as we know, green hydrogen is still in early days. Most of the projects are still relatively small scale, and but it is a space which should evolve significantly over the next years.
Thank you, Ricardo. Guilherme, do you want to add something to that?
Sure, Arthur. Although Chile has stepped first on offshore and on hydrogen, and already have a national strategy and a lot of announcements. I saw that Brazil, the last year, this subject has accelerated a lot. The subject arrived more officially here at BNDES in the end of 2020, and so since the whole year of 2021, we looked closely to the subject, and I can say that a lot of the time that we spend here is dedicated to hydrogen. We have a lot of conversations and even projects being discussed. So I think that Brazil has the same way as Chile a great potential for producing. So very good resources. But Brazil has some other advantages that Chile doesn't have that make me believe that Brazil will be certainly a very relevant player in this industry. One of, and I can say that one of these is our larger, market, internal market. So we have a lot of industrial base that can use the hydrogen internally, so create a demand internally. and not depending only on the global demand that will be developed. So for exporting the hydrogen as a commodity, but also an internal market that can, not as fast and not in the same scale, of course, as the global demand, but we can see, I can see that probably hydrogen projects will come online before the offshore wind projects, because we already have this internal demand that can, some industries committed with goals, with net zero goals that will start signing, showing their commitment, substituting, replacing a share of its production for green hydrogen. I can see that happening in the short term.
Interesting, yeah, because offshore wind in many parts of the world is more advanced than hydrogen development, which is still in the pilot stages. So interesting to see that flip, that reverse in Brazil. I wanted to address Alexandra's question. Thank you very much for posing it. The first one is regarding the investments. So as we saw in the presentation, around 80% of the $500 billion expected by 2031 is going to go to oil and gas. And Alexandra was surprised by this high number, and so was I, honestly. But I think it's because of the high amount of capital expenditure that is required for these exploration and production projects compared to developing a solar or wind farm. So I'll open this to the panel. Is it true? How does this oil and gas investments in Brazil and the large amount of it play in this energy transition? Are these assets going to get stranded? How do you guys see this increase in spending?
I can take a stab at it initially, Arthur, maybe. I think the reality of those forecasts are, I think as Rupert pointed out, there's no silver bullet here. So at the end of the day, we're talking about way too much energy. Like if you're trying to replicate that amount of energy with another solution, you'd probably be actually looking at much higher investments required. And I think at the end of the day, again, like Rupert said, is you need to focus on the best resources available. And I think, if you're balancing cost effectiveness and greenhouse gas emissions, there's no doubt that you also, natural gas especially has to play an important role in the solution. And it's just not practical to be looking at generating, the amounts of energy that we're talking about without, a responsible contribution from those technologies as well.
Fair point. If no one else wants to comment on that, I'll just move on to the last question from Alexandra. And she mentioned that the growth in distributed generation is expected for this year because of the expiration of the subsidies. But we also see growth rates continuing, very high growth rates continuing through 2031. What is driving those growth rates in distributed generation? And why is it expected to continue at this very high rate?
I can step in. I guess the subsidies are definitely not necessary anymore, because these investments in distributed generation have a very high incomes, and the change in the regulation will not change the fact that consumers in Brazil pay a very expensive tariff for energy, especially the regulated consumers, and they will keep paying these high tariffs, and the distributed generation will still be a very interesting investment, even with the transition and with the no more subsidies eventually. But one other thing, that the law that regulated this and the subsidies, they define, they mandate the regulatory agency to develop a mechanism of valuing the benefits of the distributed generation. So in some way it will be addressed, and these investments will count on this extra revenue, considering the benefits that they supply to the grid. So
great. Yeah. So essentially, distributed generation remains very competitive and is expected to see high returns even with the expiration of some of these original subsidies. So hopefully that answered your question, Alexandra. We have reached the end of our time, so I don't want to keep you guys any longer. I want to thank first and foremost the panelists for contributing with their insights. Thank you very much for those. And thank you guys for attending. We are happy to answer any other questions that you may have, whether you have a investment or a project in Brazil, or you're looking to invest in a project or asset in Brazil. We're happy to conduct a free consultation to answer any of those questions. Thank you all very much, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you.